He did not seize England with a sword. He did it with a key to the royal bedchamber, a key to the coffers, a key to the quiet places where kings make choices and favorites become indispensable. Hugh Despenser the Younger, ambitious, sharp, and shameless, rose not by battlefield triumph, but by proximity to Edward II, and for a few blazing years he ruled the realm from behind the throne. His end would be as spectacular as his ascent. A public unmaking designed to cauterize a nation's fury, born around 1286 into a respectable mid-tier noble line, Despenser looked at first like a man destined to orbit power rather than hold it. Then came the marriage that altered his gravity. By wedding Eleanor de Clare, granddaughter of Edward I and niece to the reigning Edward II, he plugged directly into the royal family's veins. Land, kinship, access, the trifecta that accelerates fortunes in medieval England. By 1318, he had the title that mattered most for a man with designs, the King's Chamberlain. The office was less a job than a location, always at Edward's side, always near the lockbox, always within whispering distance. The whispers became policy. Despenser learned quickly that England could be harvested as efficiently as any estate. He expanded his holdings aggressively, especially across South Wales, where he muscled marcher lords, manipulated lawsuits, and converted royal favor into deeds and rents. What he could not win by writ, he took by fear. Near contemporary chroniclers noticed and recoiled. The Vita Edwardi Secundi remarks that all men turned their hearts against him because of his pride and wrongdoing. It was not just envy. It was the dawning realization that the rules had changed. Courts bent. Forfeitures multiplied. The wheel of fortune spun only for those inside the Chamberlain circle, and Edward II, whether captivated, cowed, or simply dependent, he would not restrain his favorite. The king's faith in Despenser created a physics in which opponents did not compete. They vanished. Estates once considered safe by tenure or tradition found themselves absorbed into a Despenser map of England, a checkerboard of confiscation and reward aligned to one man's appetite. In the marches, he behaved like a viceroy. In Westminster, he behaved like a prime minister. To many nobles, it felt less like royal government than a personal regime. The backlash was inevitable. By 1321, a coalition of barons forced the exile of Hugh and his father, Hugh the Elder. For a brief season, the realm exhaled. But exile was only an intermission. In 1322, Edward recalled the Despensers and launched a vindictive counteroffensive. Trials were convened with outcomes foregone. Confiscations became harvest. The message was unmistakable. Opposition would be remembered. Victory would be total. Jean Lebel later observed that Despenser acted as if he were king. That was not hyperbole for those who lost lands, freedom, or kin to the Chamberlain's machinery. The regime's arrogance produced its most dangerous enemies. Queen Isabella of France, Edward's estranged consort, had watched Despenser's rise corrode the crown's dignity and isolate the king. Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord, had felt Despenser's fist personally and publicly. In 1325, Isabella crossed to France, nominally on a diplomatic mission. In reality, she was gathering allies and leverage. She sent back a simple condition: she would not return while the Despensers held power. Edward refused. The lines were drawn. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a modest army and tremendous momentum. Their force was not just soldiers, it was a reputation. Years of fear, seizure, and humiliation had primed England for revolt. Towns opened their gates. Bishops nodded rather than blocked. Great lords calculated and chose. The rebellion spread like a fire finding dry fields. Edward and Despenser fled west, aiming for the old loyalties of Wales. But loyalties had been spent like coin. On the 16th of November, near Llantrisant, Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured alongside his luckless king. The architect of others' downfalls finally stood in the open, unshielded. What followed was called a trial, but it was really a rite, a ritualized answer to years of grievance. Before Queen Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and a packed audience of magnates and townsfolk, Despenser faced charges: treason, robbery, extortion, bringing ruin to the realm. He had used the courts as weapons. Now the court became a stage. The outcome was certain because the purpose was not judgment, but demonstration. The punishment would be the message. On 24th November 1326 in Hereford's marketplace, the scaffold rose and the spectacle began. Stripped to a tunic, crowned with nettles, a cruel parody of the authority he had claimed through Edward, Despenser was dragged through the streets on a hurdle, the traitor's litter. Geoffrey Le Baker later wrote that many rejoiced at the sight. What came next belongs to the bleak inventory of medieval penalties. He was hanged and cut down before death could claim him, exposed to further indignities that symbolically purified the body of treachery, his heart torn out and cast into the fire, according to several accounts. Then the final severings: beheading, quartering, dispersal. His head went to London Bridge, his limbs to prominent cities, York, Bristol, Dover, Newcastle, so that England's map, newly relieved of his grasp, would display the proof. The violence was not gratuitous in the minds of those who ordered it. It was pedagogy. Power abused in private would be answered in public. For Edward II, imprisoned and blinking at the ruin of his protector, it marked the collapse of a reign he could no longer pretend to own. Within months, he would abdicate to his teenage son, Edward III. Within a year, he would die in custody, his end still contested by historians. For Isabella and Mortimer, the victory bought time and authority. Briefly, they too would learn that England is patient with favorites until it is not. What then does Hugh Despenser's story teach? First, that access is power. Medieval kingship was a machine fueled as much by proximity as by principle. The chamberlain's key could open vaults and bend laws. Second, that institutions matter only as much as those who steward them. Courts became instruments of confiscation because the men who ran them bowed to the atmosphere created by a weak king and a domineering favorite. Third, that political memory is long and political forgiveness is short. Despenser's enemies did not want reform. They wanted erasure. The execution's brutality makes sense only if we understand it as a public undoing, the theatrical dismantling of a man who had privatized the state. And yet the caution cuts in multiple directions. The regime that replaced Despenser framed itself as restoration and justice, but it also answered one excess with others. Mortimer's sweep did not end England's appetite for strong hands near the crown. It reset the table. Over the next decade, a young Edward III would take his own measures to end the dominance of his mother's favorite. The wheel turned again. Favorites fell again. The lesson remains. In a polity where law can be bent by intimacy, the line between governance and predation blurs quickly, and the reckoning, when it comes, tends to be theatrical. In the end, the most telling sentence may belong to the Vita Edwardi Secundi. Despenser perished deservedly, for he had been a destroyer of the realm. That was one generation's verdict on one man. History complicates as it recedes. We can acknowledge the propagandistic relish of the accounts and still recognize the pattern they describe. Hugh Despenser the Younger was not the first favorite to mistake the king's shadow for invulnerability. He would not be the last. But few left a silhouette so stark. A key in his hand, a kingdom in his pocket, and a scaffold waiting at the edge of the crowd.